Hey everybody, welcome back. Yvonne Wakefield's YouTube channel, where I'm reading from Babe in the Woods, Building a Life One Log at a Time. Tonight's chapter is pretty long, so we're going to break it into two. But before I begin, I just wanted to say, I have a good website, YvonnePepin-Wakefield.com, and I Googled it tonight, and all of my books come up. So people ask me where you can buy my books. You can buy my books anywhere books are sold. You can buy them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google, your local bookstore, or preferably, you could come here at my studio and gallery in the Dalles, Oregon, and I will gratefully sign one for you. So tonight, Arturo wanted me to show you my Hello Kitty mug, which I didn't mention in one of my sink tales about Hello Kitty. So tonight, chapter 21, I just want to regroup on chapter 20. I was in the pup tent. It was pouring rain. I went down to the old stinky rat log cabin, and there ensued a food fight with porcupine stew. So we're back into chapter 21, called The Tank and I. And Zachary's licking his paw. We were just at the cabin, and he got pine pitch on his feet. The Tank and I. The next day, it is still raining. Instead of sitting around in my tent, I decide to slog down the road and drive to town to launder porcupine stew out of my jeans and shirt. By the time my clothes are agitating, the sun has come out and I take a walk. Past Main Street is a gray board and batten house with a cottonwood tree in the front yard. A hand-stenciled sign, "Tools for Sale," is nailed into the deeply ridged bark and clearly visible through a blizzard of cottonwood seed that leads me to the front door of that house. A motherly woman in a tent-like house dress answers my knock and my questions. "Yes," she says, shrugging, "there are tools for sale." She leads me around to the backyard where there are tables made from sawhorses and plywood sheets painted the same gray as the house. Rusted and broken tools are tied together with spider webs and dead leaves and damp with rain. Among this mess is a draw knife. "How much?" I ask. I hold up the tool. "Just a minute," the woman says, and walks to a nearby shed, a grinding sound going on inside. She opens the door, the ear-splitting noise leaks out, and then there is only rustling in the cottonwood trees. I have to stop 1 minute because Zachary is on the couch here licking the pine pitch out of his paws, and it's annoying me. Go do that somewhere else, buddy. Sorry, Zachary. I'll take care of it later. Okay, "How much?" I hold up the tool. "Just a minute," the woman says, and walks to a nearby shed, a grinding sound going on inside. She opens the door and the ear-splitting noise leaks out, and then there's only rustling in the cottonwood trees. When the door opens, a man steps out, and I keep my eyes focused on the draw knife blade to keep from looking at him, to keep from asking, "What happened to your head?" Well over 6 feet with shoulders like boulders, a barrel of a belly, and a face that makes me face the other way, the man beads on the draw knife in my hand. $6, he says. $6? I put the draw knife back on the table. I'd bought a draw knife I use now at a flea market in Minnesota for $3.50 or for $3, and it was in better shape than this one. The big man raises his hand, and reflexively I duck. "Name's Dan. Dan Gray. Gray like the paint." "Nice to meet you," I say, taking his hand, still avoiding looking him in the eye, and prepare to walk away. "Okay, you can have it for $5 then." Dan Gray hands me the draw knife. I must face him to negate his offer. You must have been collecting this stuff a long time. I nod around to the yard. Stacks of windows and doors lean against a rickety fence. Wooden crates are filled with doorknobs, spikes, hasps, hinges. Propped against the shed are kitchen and bathroom sinks, rusty stovepipes, 3 wood-burning cook stove, and pieces of equipment I haven't seen before. It's a milking machine, a chicken meal grinder, a corn sheller, Dan says flatly. I can figure out the milking machine, but the others, you put cow bones in there and grind away. He points to what looks like a hand wringer washing machine. Mix it with grain for the chickens. He turns the handle on a piece of oblong metal. You put dried corn cobs in there, crank this. He ratchets the handle on the other contraption and explains. The kernels come off and are used to plant. Got a lot of this stuff out of Bates. None of this, though. He sweeps his arm out at the equipment he has described. Dan Gray looks at the draw knife in my hand. Not this either. Before I walk back to the laundromat to dry my clothes, I have purchased over $20 worth of old tools, 2 wood blocks and tackle pulleys, a rusted peavey, a concave whetstone, a post hole digger with bent tongs, and a draw knife, all of them with faces beaten by time and neglect. I plan to polish them up, put them to use, and give these orphan tools a new home where they will be appreciated and cared for. Actually, when I was at the cabin last week, I was still sharpening those same old tools. After the laundry is dried and folded, I drive back to Dan Gray's to pick up and pay for my purchases. In the bargain, I make a new friend with a face hard to look in the eye. Woo-wee, nice car. Dan Gray has been waiting on his porch step for me to return to pay and pick up the tools. He holds the peavey and post hole digger in one hand and meets me at the curb. I exchange a crisp $20 bill and 4 wilted singles from my recent bank withdrawal. He said he would not take a check. I open the hatchback and fold down the rear seat to make room for the post hole digger. The other tools I stuff into the top of an already full pack. The sight of a red backpack about half the size of a teenager and her little green car in this 4-wheel drive truck-loving town leads to questions and answers. You mean you're going to haul all that stuff up in that? Dan removes his elbow from the gremlin's roof and points to my backpack. In the course of explanation, Dan Gray learns from my mountaintop predicament and tells me where I can buy a truck. It's just west of town. Dan thumbs the bridge of where his nose would normally have been. Want to go see, he asks. It's early afternoon when I get into the gremlin with a man testing its payload. Dan has to slouch down in the seat and the passenger side axles groan and sink. Just head toward Mount Vernon, he says, and we drive Highway 26 in that direction. Black-faced Hefford is spilled out in barbed wire on a hanging sign swinging between 2 posts. Just beyond the main gate is a weathered green truck parked next to a tractor and hay baler. There's not a black-faced Hefford in sight. By the time I leave this place, $300 poor, the only animal I've seen is a dog. Mr. Crystal sees us walking around the oxidized army green pickup parked just outside the post. He is the owner of both the truck and the Australian Shepherd, with one clear blue eye, the other black. After introductions and a quick look under the hood, I hand Mr. Crystal a check. Needs a valve job, a new muffler, he says, pocketing the check, the dog heeling instinctively beside his master. Dan Gray graciously offers to handle the transfer of registration. "'Cause you're still a minor," he explains. After the laws changed in Minnesota, I was considered an adult at 18. I didn't have to wait until I was 21 and could receive my inheritance 3 years earlier, vote, and legally buy and drink alcohol. Only part of this law applied to me in Oregon, where I was old enough to buy land, but too young to buy a drink and immature enough to believe a man. Dan Gray takes the registration papers from Mr. Crystal, who has removed them from the incubator-sized glove compartment. I think there's a charge involved in this transfer to my name, says my new advisor. How much? Dan looks over at the rancher as he scrutinizes the empty range. Oh, probably about $20 or so. Dan shoves his hand deep into his pocket. Mr. Crystal keeps focus on his cows that won't come home. Dan Gray drives back to John Day in my new truck. I follow in the Gremlin. He parks it alongside his front yard curb where it will be safe until I return to take it to the mechanics. Before I drive home, I have to go back to the bank to withdraw another 20. I return to Dan's house, hand him the 20, and look with wonder on the washed out truck I've just bought, now sitting under and getting snowed on by cottonwood seeds. That evening, I stagger more than usual up the mountain with an uneven load, a blunt post-hole digger for support, hoping this will be the last of such climbs now that I own a 1962 3/4 ton Dodge pickup. I bought a truck, I tell Jim the next morning when he comes to work. It's green. I bought it from a Mr. Crystal. I know that truck, Jim says as he hoists his toolbox from the bed. I drive by it every day on my way here and home. Crystal's had it sitting outside his barn ever since he bought it from some logger whose face was crushed by a tree butt. Is he a really big logger named Gray? Yes, I believe so, Jim says, setting down the toolbox to scrutinize the rising log walls. I think we're ready to cut out the door, maybe even a window today. Does that logger look like his face has been rearranged? I also stare at the log walls now and wonder, and they are taller than me. Yes, Jim says, and we walk up to the cabin, scale a ladder he built from tamarack and pine. Jim sets his toolbox on the newly laid porch, takes out a 4-foot level, and places it perpendicular to the floor. Here, hold this straight so I can mark it. What happened to his face? I hold the level and Jim draws a straight line over the curvy logs. Logging accident. Butt twisted off the stump, kicked back. Broke nearly every bone from his chin up except his forehead. They call him mashed potato face. I hold the level steady as Jim pencils a cutting edge. Silently, I curse the cruel sucks who would nickname a maimed man. We wedge chunks of wood between tiers to keep the walls from collapsing when the door opening is sawed out. Since this is the virgin aperture, the first of several, I want to create the threshold I will carry myself over. To do this, I must hold the chainsaw steady 1.5 feet over my head while slicing down straight. On the first try, the saw kicks back. I try again and again, working against leverage and altitude. Finally, because I don't want to end up looking like Dan Gray, I hand the saw to Jim. Brad shows up later than usual to begin work. I asked to help him hammer guards for the window while Jim finishes sawing out the door. Here, I'll do that. Brad takes the level from me. I select some straight 1-bys and prepare to hammer them against Brad's marks. He takes the boards from me and nails the guides in place. An aluminum tool and a 1-inch thick wood are the only exchanges we make. Neither of us has said a thing, but I can feel words fighting to come off the tips of our tongues. Instead of asking, "What's gotten into you?" I say, "Thanks," and proceed to saw out the newly marked window. Because the window is set lower than the door, I can saw without stretching too far overhead. Before I can pull the echo to start, Brad powers up the new saw and begins cutting. I stand to the side watching and then tap him on the shoulder after he has made his first cut. I want to do that. I yell over the motor. He looks at me and keeps sawing. I tap him on the shoulder more firmly the second time. He turns. I reach over and flick the switch in the direction of off. "What the hell are you doing?" he yells, preparing to yank the saw back into action. I said, "I want to do that." I put my hand on the saw to take it. He jerks it away. "You want to get this window cut out today? Then let me do it." Jim has disappeared. It's only Brad and me and a face-off that has been escalating. "Look, it's my saw." I try to tug it away. "And my cabin. I want to build it too." "Then build it your own fucking way." Brad lets go of the saw and it crashes into my shins. "Because I'm fucking out of here." He storms off the porch, down the ladder, and crosses the creek. Through the trees, I see him taking down his tent. Jim has reappeared. "Need help?" he asks, never meeting my eye. I start the saw and then begin to cut. He works with me, catching each log I saw before it crashes onto my foot. By the time the window is cut, Brad has returned. He lays his fully loaded pack on the green tarp and then climbs up on the pole ladder to the main floor, where he nearly kneed the life out of his manhood. "Goodbye, Jim. It's time for me to go. It's been good working with you." Brad shakes Jim's hand. He gives me a cold shoulder, climbs down the porch, and hefts his pack. I think this is the only way he can tell me he wants to leave to return to his lover, or that my bossiness has tripped up his manliness. "Brad, let me give you some money. I plan to follow him down to my camp and write out a check for gratitude for all the help he has given me so far." "Keep it," he says, teetering under the weight of his pack. He squats by the tarp, picks up a nearly full 5-pound jar of peanut butter, and walks off. After Brad is out of sight, I stand dumbfounded on the porch, clenched down to keep from crying, not because he left, but because I think I'm a bad person, and that is why he left. "You damn thing." Jim breaks my woe is me reverie. He reappears from the woods, stands beside me, looking down the road. "You need to find better friends." He slaps me on the back and then returns to work. The only people I feel friendly about here, I've known only briefly, like Jim, the judge, the Nelsons, and the Tatons, Emery, and Brad before he took off. Maybe Dan Gray. I'm warily warming to him since he has offered to help me fix the truck. 3 days after I bought it, I find the truck in front of Dan Gray's house, but not exactly where I left it parked. The keys that were supposed to be left under the floor mat, I find in the driver's side door pocket. The gas gauge, which registered half full when I left the truck curbside, now needles down to empty. As I sit behind the wheel waiting for the engine to warm up, I realize I am not anatomically correct enough to drive this rig. Because I only sat in the truck once before but didn't drive it, I had no idea. I'm too short to see over the steering wheel, let alone push the clutch, step on the gas, and steer. Sitting erect as possible, I just see over the odometer, the speedometer, set in a dashboard wide as a coffin. Dan Gray comes around the corner of his house just as I slouch back with misgiving. "Morning. Going for a drive?" He rubs a phantom cheekbone as I explain the situation, looking up at him through the open driver's window. "Oh, that's no problem," he says, and walks back to his shop, then returns coming out of the front door of his house, holding 2 pillows, duct tape, and a pair of 2x4 chunks. He tapes the blocks on the front side of the clutch and gas pedal. "Here you go." Dan unlatches the seat, pushes it up as far as it will go, then pats the pillow and says, "Now try this out for size." He tapes the blocks on the front side of the clutch and gas pedal. "Here you go." Dan unlatches the seat, pushes it up as far as it will go, pats the pillow and says, "Now try this on for size." Glad for wearing long jeans that hot afternoon, I try to keep from imagining the source of stains under my butt. If I teeter on the pillow, pull myself forward enough so I'm draped over the wheel, I can see over the dash, over the work and pedals and steer. So positioned with both hands, I work on moving a shift stick that has the same kind of grudge I once encountered with an old window casing. Geared in neutral, I scooch down, push in the clutch. I'm going to find a gas station to fill the tank and fix the truck, I tell Dan as I'm straining to move a steering wheel as cranky as the stick shift. Dan says he wants to come along for the ride, but first let me call a friend. He walks into his house and then backs out with a broad grin on his face. To move the truck away from the curb requires the strength of 2 longshoremen. Dan reaches over and pushes the wheel as I pull it left. The gears grind as I shift up from second to third. You got to put your shoulders into it. Dan reaches from the passenger side, puts a meaty hand on the steering wheel, and helps me crank the truck around the corner, gradually releasing his grip. At that very moment, my new truck earns the nickname Tank. Take a right. I got a friend you want to meet. He's willing to take a look at your truck. Really? I turn to face Dan and then quickly direct my eyes back on the road. That's very nice of you. I was just going to drive to a gas station. Gas station's only good for gassing trucks, not fixing them. After I fill up in John Day, it's a pretty straight 8 miles to Dan's friend's house in Mount Vernon. During the drive, I begin to think it might be wise to wear a kidney belt and always carry a passenger to help me steer Tank. Those 8 miles are covered at 40 miles an hour as the truck backfires, jerks, and sways like a geriatric beluga down Highway 26. The entire drive, Dan yells, "Get your shoulder into it," even on the most gradual curves. Finally, I beach the beast in front of a sheet metal Quonset shop. The hand-painted sign in the window says, "Closed." "Dang," says Dan. Said he'd be here after church. He looks at his watch and then at me. Maybe he went home for lunch first. I agree when Dan says, "Wounded Buffalo just across the street." We could go there, wait and see. I follow Dan into the diner that has seen better days, but as good as it gets around here. We take a booth in full view of Albert's garage. "Thanks, just coffee for me." I hand the menu back to the waitress, old enough to be my grandmother. Dan orders a double cheeseburger, extra fries, coffee, and a Coke. I stir some sugar and cream into my coffee because I'm really hungry, but nothing other than the side salad appeals to me. Plus, I'm hoping Albert's will arrive before I have a chance to eat and we can get to work, because my background qualifies me to tinker under the hood with an experienced mechanic. In my senior year of high school, I took a shop class, an elective open only to boys. After challenging this, I was pretty much left alone as the first girl ever to roll in shop class. Still, I managed to keep up learning how to gap plug, strap an oil filter wrench, and other basic automotive skills. While I was flunking geometry miserably, I was contentedly figuring out problems with greasy parts and aced the course. This basic training is why I expect to partake in tanks overhauling. Knowing how to keep all 6 cylinders pumping and the engine running is just another course of my survival. Dan's order appears. He gobbles the burger and stuffs a fist filled with fries into the gap the plastic surgeons crafted to look like a mouth. He gulps the Coke, slurps the coffee. Another, he holds out his empty cup to the waitress, old enough to be his mother, and receives a 5th coffee refill and the check. "Dang," he says, patting down every pocket. "I forgot my wallet." I stand, pat my pocket, assured of my wallet's safe location, and watch a cherried-out Ford truck parked next to the Quonset shop. Although I feel I should, I don't want to question or even make a joke of my new friend's forgetfulness as I hand a 5 to the grandmother and wait for change. "There he is." Dan grabs a bunch of plastic wrapped peppermints next to the cash register, plunges that fist into his pocket, takes a wad of toothpicks, sticks one in his mouth and the rest in his shirt. I wedge the change, a single bill, and some coins beside my coffee cup and follow Dan out the door across the street. Albert Alberts is a fit-looking 40-year-old with the stoop of an arthritic man twice his age, his posture the result of half his life spent standing on cement floors and bent under hoods. Like Dan Gray, he is known locally by his first and last name, as they are conjoined, like Baby Ruth. If his first name were not preceded by the last name, either man would lose identity in a country with a small load of Alberts and a ton of Dans. Somehow Dan Gray has convinced Albert Alberts, a Seventh-day Adventist, to come to work after church that Saturday. Albert Alberts parks in the shade of his shop. He points a greasy fingernail towards the tank. "That your old truck? What's it doing back here?" Albert Alberts turns to Dan. "Thought you sold it to Crystal." I stand in the shade of a single bay garage sheet metal shop as they greet each other. "It's hers now," Dan answers, points to me, and the introduction and the explanation stops there. Albert Alberts unlocks the office, goes inside and wrestles open a squealing hinge shop door. Dan tosses the pillow aside, adjusts the seat as far back as will go, and drives tank inside the cool garage. Albert lifts up the hood, bends over, and declares, "Head looks warped." "You'll need a new muffler, of course, points, plugs, oil filter. Valves look kind of shot, too." Albert Alberts looks up from under the hood at Dan Gray. Not me. I follow Albert Alberts' wrench as he outlines the problems I can't see. Can try resurfacing this, though. He turns to find Dan in a chair by the wall, reading a 3-year-old copy of Hot Rod. "You never did fix that leaky radiator when you had it, did you?" Dan nods, turns a page. For over an hour, I stand beside Albert Alberts, helping him ratchet, wrench, gap, lube, and seal. It's hot in that hut, and under the hood, I am continually wiping sweat from my face. All this time, Albert Alberts only says to me, "Hold this," or "Hand me that." In one attempt at dialogue, he offers, "You see here?" He points to the tip of a spark plug, corroded as all heck, dark as the devil. "Dan," he yells, and Dan pretends not to hear. "Didn't you ever once change the plugs when you had this rig?" Late afternoon heat expands, and the sheet metal building starts creaking and groaning. "Not anything else I can do for you today?" "Here," says Albert Alberts, wiping his hands on a greasy rag and handing it to me. I wring it between my palms and then wipe sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. "Let's go across the street for coffee. I'll figure up your bill." Heat waves hover above the asphalt as we cross the street. Inside the Wounded Buffalo, our sweat cools fast, and the three of us take a seat. This time, Dan orders only coffee. With parts and labor today, it comes to $36. Albert Alberts has been writing on a pocket-sized receipt book. He hands me the slip of paper. The men order a second refill. I write out a check, put the checkbook back in my pocket, and go to the ladies' room to freshen up. As I'm washing my hands in the basin below a mirror, I see my black streaked forehead and cheeks. "How come you guys didn't tell me I had grease all over my face?" I say before sitting back down. "Didn't think it mattered," is all Dan can say. "Bring her back next week," is all Albert Alberts has to say. He puts down $1 for a tip and then goes to pay for the coffee. The bill blows off the table. Dan picks it up and not so secretly slips it into his pocket. The grandmotherly waitress rings up 3 coffees at 30 cents per cup. Albert hands her a $1 bill, and he puts the 2-nickel change in the donation jar on the counter to help 6-year-old Veronica's medical bills. A Polaroid of a sick-looking kid taped on the lid. Dorothy Gray drives the family station wagon, follows me in the Gremlin, and we caravan behind Dan Gray in the train. All 3 vehicles stop in the judge's meadow. Their occupants disembark. Just as I'm settling into my new truck, Dorothy approaches the driver's windows. "Can I have my kids' pillows back?" I hand them over, and the Grays drive away. The Gremlin stays parked. I sit on my knapsack and begin my virgin drive up the mountain. Within 2 minutes, I realized I can hike the distance faster than I can drive it in tank. Of all the checking he did, Albert Alberts didn't get to the ground and check the emergency brake. I quickly discovered this when tank starts rolling downhill just as I get out of the cab to open the first rosehip gate. I turn off the engine, put it into gear, and put a boulder under the front tire for added safety. Later that week, I meet Albert Albert alone. He teaches me how to pull the head, how to clean it with a scraper, bar, air hose, electric drill, and brush. Albert's friends come over to watch as we work under the hood. They sit in chairs against the wall, making snide remarks I ignore. I hear grease monkey, women's liver, gal, and chick. Albert Albert says, "Get out of my shop now," to the man who just has said, "Hey, Albert, you get dirty like that with your wife?" Albert Alberts watches the man's back all the way out the door. After more pulling and scraping and sweating, streaming, he says, "Head's so warped, resurfacing won't work. It needs to be replaced. Let's go get some coffee." And he hands me his rag. This time I've taken the precaution of looking in tank's side mirror for signs of grease and enter wounded buffalo with a clean face. Greg, one of the other men hanging out in Albert Albert's garage, joins us. 3 coffees all around. "I'd never make my woman work on a truck," Greg snorts, stirs a spoon of sugar into his cup, and continues, "You a woman's liver or what?" He doesn't wait for me to answer. "I think a woman's liver stuff is all a bunch of bullshit." "Greg," Albert Albert gives his friend a dirty look. "Well, it's a bunch of bullshit. A woman's never ever going to be able to work like a man." Greg smirks and drinks his coffee in one gulp. "So you woman's liver? 'Cause you're sure trying to look like a man." I'm Yvonne, a woman. I pick up the check, pay for 2 coffees, and leave Albert Alberts with this warped head case. After the bald tires have been replaced, the front end aligned, new shocks, muffler pistons, head, I will have spent nearly 3 times what it cost to buy the truck. Like my new friends, it will be something I can rely on most of the time. All right, we're going to stop here on this chapter. We've got 8 more pages, but this truck, that tank, was a blessing and a pain at the same time. It was always forever breaking down, and it wasn't, it didn't have 4-wheel drive, so it was very limited the times I could use it, but basically I used it for hauling in the summer. You'll find out what happened to it. Actually, you'll find out what happened to it in the second book, Babe in the Woods Self-Portrait. So I hope you guys have all had a good evening, or whatever time you've been listening or watching to this. We will see you next week. Stay hydrated in your favorite mug of the choice. Bye-bye.